what I'm going to do is talk about why we communicate with these people, and then talk a bit about how we go about it, practicalities, things like that. But very much this is for you to ask questions, because as much as Jamie is right in saying that I've done lots of stuff, whether I've had any impacts is a completely different matter. And that's part of what we need to think about here. So as my opening image, I've used the least appropriate way of trying to communicate your findings, which is the person who's far too involved in their work to really be making any sense, to be making any kind of purchase. But I think, first thing to think about is exactly why are you even doing this? And I think lots of different reasons that people will have. Partly it's about kind of sense of professional obligation. It might be useful for your career. It might be that you see your work has clear applications for the non-academic world. Whatever it is, though, the reason I'm asking this question is that you have to be clear to yourself about why you're doing it. You need to know what you're trying to get out of it, because if you're not clear about what your role in all of this is, then it's going to be very difficult to achieve that. And also you run the risk of being kind of battered around, because I think one of the real challenges of engaging with policymakers and politicians is that you are a very unimportant part of their lives in almost every circumstance. So if you want to achieve your objectives, you need to be clear about pushing towards those as you go ahead. Two other points, having said that, is I think it's important to be optimistic about doing this, that there are lots of examples where people have done research which has helped inform debates, shaped the way we understand the world, made things a bit better in some way. And I think, having those ambitions, those kind of sense of the potential is really useful. At the same time, totally, you have to be realistic that most of the time it is hard to get people to listen to you. It is even harder to get people to do what it is that you have said they should do in light of your research. But, it doesn't mean that you should stop trying. And I think one of the things here is thinking about this in the long term, that it's not just about you do a thing and that's it. It's about building relationships, working with people over years, in many cases, if not decades, in order to kind of shape and nudge things to where they can be a bit better than they were before. But that's just kind of, I think, setting the stage. What seems more useful for me to talk about here is thinking about some key principles, some kind of guiding ideas that can help you in this kind of work. And the one thing that I'm going to totally focus on again and again throughout this talk, and I will want to be the one message you take away from this, is that you have to think about what your target audience needs and wants. The whole process of engagement is recognizing that it is not about you, it is about them, and that if you don't speak their language and engage with their agendas, then this becomes an almost impossible task. I don't want to suggest that your ideas are not powerful and well informed, but your ability to recast the agenda of the political world or the policy world in any domain is really very small. And so learning to speak the language, literally and metaphorically, of your target audience, understand what it is that they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve, the way that their work operates, the kind of pressures that they're under, is really central. So, to take the obvious example, talking to you today, I'm speaking to a group of colleagues. I'm speaking to a group of people who have got some kind of shared interest in this kind of field. So I'm talking in a particular way to you, in a way that I think best serves your needs. Now, you can tell me in the Q&A afterwards, which we're not recording, that I've got that wrong, and that's fine. But it's trying to understand, put myself in your shoes to give you something that I think is as useful as it can be. And that's a really important first step, because often we are like that picture on the first slide of, here's the thing I do. I love my thing. I'm really involved in my thing. I'm going to tell you everything about my thing. And that's quite a hard barrier for a policymaker who has 1,001 different things to do, who maybe has lots and lots of other people coming with their own ideas and their own takes on a particular policy area or topic. How do you reach the person you're trying to reach? And so that empathizing and putting yourself in their position is absolutely crucial. So that's about thinking about the formats, the language, the timing, the people that you try and reach out to, the ways in which you do it. All of that is really a central principle, that you need to work from their needs rather than from yours, although at the same time still remembering what it is you're trying to achieve. Second key principle for me is really one of trying to think about building dialogues rather than transmission. As Jamie suggested in the introduction, I've been doing this kind of work for quite some time, and I'm lucky enough to work in a field of research that keeps on giving in terms of opportunities to have discussions, which is around relations between the UK and the European Union. Now, that's a topic which has gone through some periods of relative quiet, I believe, and some longer periods of relative busyness. But the people who are involved, particularly at the more technical level, hang around, and actually politicians hang around too, I've noticed. And thinking about how you can make a connection. It's not that you have to solve a problem, and patently we haven't solved the problem of what relationship there should be between the UK and the European Union, but being helpful, showing that you have something potentially useful to offer as topics emerge, thinking about being there to help navigate issues as they come through, is where you start to really build up more weight and more opportunity for having influence. And again, it kind of goes back to that first point about thinking about what your target audience needs, that the more you can listen to them as much as you tell them things, the better you can get a sense of what it is that you're trying to achieve. So it's a bit like a classroom, that having that kind of seminar discussion where you have the interaction, and that you understand where they are, what they want, how that works, allows you to tailor your message and your content in a way that meets their needs all the better. Of course, all of this supposes that you know who your target audience is, and I think this is important. That the title that we've put this under of policymakers and politicians is a very big one, and I think it's useful to think about how you break that up. Thinking as much as possible about individual needs, individual situations, as much as you can know those, is part of what you can do. So rather than trying to have a one way of talking to all of these people all of the time, breaking that up and tailoring it and doing something specific. Third principle for me is thinking about ownership. And I think this is something that, as I was putting together my notes on this, I was just reflecting on it, that one of the challenges that we have is we're often very invested in our research. We've put a lot of time and effort into that work, and you've got a lot of connection to it. And so what you want to do is to recognize that you've got to let go a bit, that once you throw your ideas into a public domain, and that's not just with policymakers, it's also with the media, it's in any kind of social interactions that you're having, you lose a degree of control, and that you have to uh, accept that that's how it's going to be. And I'm sure we can all think of examples of colleagues whose work has gone out into the world and then has been picked up and used, and in some cases misused by other people. You know, it becomes a stick to beat people around the head with, or a way of framing an agenda that is not at all what the original researcher intended. So I think you have to accept that there is a degree of losing ownership at some point. And so that's why it's really important for you to do a really good job at the point that you're sharing it, to try and frame it in a way that minimizes the risk of that. Now, one thing I'd say, and this session is partly in anticipation of the event that we're having in Parliament in May, is always, if there's something going out in your name about your research, check it. Check that you're happy with the text. If it's gone through Marcom, or it's gone through anybody else, in fact, your professional association, your study group, whatever, you need to sign off on things to make sure that you are not being misrepresented or attributed to things that are not what you want to say. And to give you an example of that, I had a colleague at my previous institution who had done some work. The press office had written a press release which made some extravagant and inaccurate claims off the back of the version my colleague had produced. That went out without it being shown to my colleague, and that whipped up a big social media frenzy and lots of unpleasant debates that ensued from that. And that could all have been avoided if there had been a proper signing off of the text, because that would never have gone out if my colleague had seen that. So as much as possible, check what is being written for you, and as much as possible, write the things, produce the things yourself, so that you are not putting yourself in the hands of other people more than you have to. So 3 ideas there to really guide what you're doing and help to improve the chances of making a connection with other people. That's a bit abstract though. And so, having made some careful notes on that, I was thinking, well, actually what people would want is something that's a bit more practical. So slide 4 is practicalities. Again, you're going to notice there's a pattern here. There are only 3 bullet points. Don't try and do everything all at once, is my first suggestion. I think as academics, we are very much conditioned to the model of the academic paper or the monograph, where we have to set out our reasoning, go through all the steps, footnote things, here's my chain of logic, to get to the meaty stuff at the end. Engaging with policymakers and politicians, you don't really, or you rarely have that luxury to set out all of your reasoning. Instead, what you need to do is to be direct. What is the application of your knowledge to the problem that they are trying to solve? So that means not, you can say, I can explain this further, but the starting point is the thing that's useful. And so that means being very clear. It means avoiding jargon as much as possible. It means being brief as much as possible. And it means doing it well. And by focusing just on one thing, that's typically a very small and circumscribed thing, the better the chances of actually getting that message through in a clear way, in a way that's actually going to make a connection to your audience. So, again, if you're thinking about this not just as a one-off interaction of I send some stuff out and I hope that it lands somewhere, but trying to build a dialogue, it becomes less of a problem, because it's not that you have to get your one shot and that's the only time you can do all the things. It's at this point we'll talk about this, at that point we'll talk about that, and so on. So I think, just in any kind of interaction with policymakers and politicians, think about what it is you want to achieve through that particular interaction. What's the message that you want? So I've already told you what the one message I want you to take from this talk is, which is work to your audience's needs. Make sure you get that message up there at the top. Now, I've been bad because I left that till slide 3, so it's buried in the middle. But I think for any of you who've done media training, it's the same kind of message that you'll have got there, that you've got to be clear about what's the thing that you have to tell the person who's interviewing you. And that needs to be right up there, and it needs to be reinforced again and again. And then if you work from that, if you have that central point, then you can kind of build out from that, and it makes sense logically about why you need to tell them the other things to make that make sense. Second practicality is, if you like, one step behind the material interaction, which is about being responsive and being available. I'm sure you have colleagues who don't reply to emails, or who reply to emails some days later. Now, often there are good reasons for that, but the pace of the policy-making world and the political world is typically much faster than that of the academic world. And so if someone is getting in touch with you, as much as possible, you need to be responding as quickly as you can. And ideally, pretty much by sort of return, or, as soon as you see the correspondence, that you're getting back in touch with them. Now, being responsive doesn't mean that you have to be available. I think policymakers fully understand that it's not that you can drop everything, although occasionally I've met people who do think that there's nothing an academic does that is more important than talking to this person. But usually, just even if it's just saying, thank you for your email, I'm sorry I can't deal with that, or I can't help this time, but I can direct you to some other people, or I'm free from this point. Again, just demonstrating that you are there, that you respond to communications quickly, that they're not being left to wait to wonder, has the email arrived? Are you still at the institution? Any of those kind of things is actually a really important part of it. And certainly I've noticed that in media circles, that journalists talk to people who talk to them, which is why you keep on seeing the same people, because even though those people aren't necessarily experts in the topic under discussion, the journalist is confident that that person will turn up and be available should they get in touch. But as much as you can, being available, making the space, exploring the options, starting conversations is a useful kind of thing. And, people who work in policymaking, people who are politicians, are people. And, like everyone else, they respond to people who are engaging, who are interested, who, are actually willing to, put something into building a relationship. So you need to think a little bit about that part of it. And I think, if you think about the way this works, part of being available is also about putting yourself out there. You have to assume that relatively few policymakers are deeply invested in the academic literature, or indeed invested at all in the academic literature. And so, thinking about different ways that you can reach out to people. So one of the reasons I do media work is partly because it provides a profile to people who aren't in the media, that when my topic comes up, that I might be a person to talk to. Excuse me. Last practicality is yet another step back, which is keeping track, keeping records. Now, I'm going to frame this as just good housekeeping point, but it's also a ref point. Knowing who you've talked to, what you've talked to them about, is just very useful. That again, often, as I've said, the areas we're working in are things which come around again and again. And so remembering that you've had a conversation with someone a couple of years ago at an event, or you've had an exchange on a phone call or whatever, can be useful for just kind of making sure that you know where you're picking up and knowing what it is that they're doing. And I think one of the things that's always very useful is that as you spend more time in your chosen field, you find that people move around. And the person who was the most junior person in the department of whatever now runs the department of whatever, or the backbencher now is a minister. That again, your connections that you built up over time are ones which become more consequential as that person moves up through their own career progression. So, but you need to keep track. So, if I've got a pile of business cards out of camera shot, and so I kind of keep the business cards that I've got, and I won't say that I file them, they're in a pile, but at least I have them. And so I have a sense if I've met people before and, how they're moving around. And that's useful for my research as well. For ref purposes, keeping track is also really essential, because if you're going to be part of an impact case study, and some of you will know that you will, but most of you won't know that you will, but you might. And I think with impact, because it is very uncertain and it's not entirely in your control, you should assume that at some point you will be part of an impact case study, at which point you'll need to be providing evidence of your impact on people. So just, if you can be gathering evidence, if you want to use those kind of terms, from the start, that is a really helpful thing to do, because that's vastly simpler as an activity if you're doing it simultaneously compared to trying to do it after the fact or several years after the fact. So good housekeeping, being present, being engaged, and then doing a good job, and kind of keeping it concise and timely is important. Now, with that in mind, I'm aware that I'm coming up to my half hour. So final slide. Let's think about what I actually practically do. What I do is I spend time playing around on PowerPoint. I make what for many of you will seem to be incredibly weak PowerPoint slides and incredibly boring PowerPoint slides. So a lot of what I do in terms of my general public engagement is keep track of what's going on and trying to explain things to myself, but also to people I engage with. So I have a blog set up here at the OU, which is mirrored to a couple of other sites. My study association being one of those places. I use social media. I will take media opportunities that are relevant to my domain. But actually, the thing that seems to have made the biggest impact over the last 5 or 6 years has been making these kinds of diagrams. This is about the Windsor framework, which is part of the Northern Ireland Protocol, as part of the Brexit process. And in that, actually, I think is a good example of the kinds of ways that I'm working. So it's something that I made. I put that out on social media. I then had a couple of colleagues who came back with comments and corrections and elaborations. I've credited them. I've got my affiliations. I've got a license about how it can be used. I've got records about which version it is, because as you can see, that's a version 9 of how that could have 9 versions, but it does have 9 versions, so that I know which one we're looking at. That's available as a PDF on a repository that's available publicly. All those things where it says links and notes and you can see hyperlinks. If you go on the PDF, you can click on that and that takes you back to the root documentation. So something like this, which is very technical and it's quite complicated, having said you should do something simple. Actually, this does one job. It's kept up to date as that process was going through. And I know from talking to people subsequently that civil servants in the UK and in quite a few other European countries regularly use these diagrams and these kind of pieces of work to help make sense of what's going on. And off the back of that, we've gained access to do interviews for the current project that we're involved in, which at some level seems somewhat ridiculous that my dubious PowerPoint skills could produce that kind of output. But the point is that I've done something which is useful to a need. Nobody else has bothered to do this kind of work because, frankly, it's quite boring to do, but it's actually a useful kind of thing. So again, we're building a dialogue, we're building an interaction. Those connections that I make are then useful for me thinking about what else is useful to do in terms of this kind of work. And we build incrementally as we go along. So that's just one example, but I'm happy to talk about other things and I don't want to overstep my time. So I will stop there and I welcome your questions. Thank you.